If I were to ask you right now what the biggest difference is between Protestants and Catholics, you would probably say papacy, sola scriptura, infant baptism, priesthood, or maybe the debate over faith alone. And sure, those are all real differences. But underneath all of them is something much deeper, a fundamental difference in how we actually understand God Himself. And that's exactly what Bishop Barron is about to explain. Let's listen.
When I was a seminary professor, I taught the course in the Reformation. So I had the guys read a lot of Luther, a lot of Calvin. Calvin, who's so much like Aquinas in many ways. Then we'd read the decretals of the Council of Trent. And so we'd look at the great 16th century debates, right? And we could revisit all those issue by issue, justification and original sin and so on and so forth. But what always struck me was, underneath these great debates, there's a fundamental difference. And I identify it as the shift from an analogical conception of being to a univocal conception of being. So in Thomas Aquinas, prime example of this, you have an analogical conception of being, whereby God is ipsum esse. God is what it means to be in the full sense. And then creatures are participants in the to be of God. They derive their being in its entirety from the sheer act of existing, which God has. Therefore, we name God in an analogical way from creatures, right? But the analogical conception of being is this participative understanding, whereby the world is never in competition with God, because the world and God are not beings against the same ontological background, if that makes sense. Now, like there's you and me, and there's the camera, and then there's God as a supreme being, and then there's that other camera, and He's not one being among many. So Aquinas, for example, will say God is not in any genus, not even the genus of being. It's an extraordinary thing to say, right? You think that, well, at least He's in the genus of being, right? There's you and me, and there's God. We're all beings. And Thomas says, no, God does not belong in the genus even of being. Why? Because He's not one being among many. Okay, that's a quick Thomas Aquinas. Well, then go up through Scotus, go especially into Occam, and you see the shift from an analogical conception of being to a univocal conception of being. Namely that being, the word to be, means the same whether it's applied to a creature or to God. That means that it is true that God is a being among many. Now come up from Occam into nominalism, and then into the nominalism that shaped undoubtedly Luther and Calvin and many of the reformers. And so I always sense behind the great debates about justification and so on is this fundamental shift from what I would call a non-competitive understanding of the divine human or divine creature relationship to a competitive one. If God is a being among many, supreme being alongside of other beings, well, then it's hard to say God gets all the glory without saying, and I get no glory. God does everything, therefore I have to do nothing. And see, as a Catholic, I always balk at that when I read it in the Reformers. I think, well, no, you can say both those things. You should say both those things. And I go back to Irenaeus, right? The Gloria Dei Homo Vivens. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. And so what glorifies God is when we are fully participating in His way of being, that we are, I'll use Catholic language, cooperating with His grace with tremendous panache and enthusiasm. And that's what I've always intuited behind the 16th century debates, between very smart people. But it's a more fundamental disagreement about the way God relates to the world, non-competitively or competitively. So anyway, and I think if you read Thomas Aquinas, you'll get that idea. You'll get the analogical conception of being, which in turn makes a huge difference.
As Bishop Barron points out, Protestants often see God as one being among many, whereas Catholics see Him as the very essence of being itself. And once you grasp that difference, everything else suddenly begins to make sense. Let me summarize it for you. Protestants believe that God belongs to the same category of being as humans, which means they place God as one among the many within the universe. Plants, animals, angels, humans, and then there is God. So according to this way of thinking, any glory given to creation must be glory taken away from God, because everything is competing within the same order of being, isn't it? This is why Protestants often struggle with the intercession of saints, priesthood, or our devotion to Mary, since to them all of these appear to rob God of the honor that belongs to Him alone. Catholics, on the other hand, believe that God is not one being among many, but rather the very essence of being itself. This means God and humanity are not even on the same playing field and therefore not in competition with each other. Instead, when humanity reflects His glory, it does not diminish God in the slightest, but magnifies Him, because He is the very source and ground of all existence. That is why Catholics can boldly say with the Church Fathers, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. And Bishop Barron will unfold this truth even more deeply in the next clip.
But that's exactly on the point I'm making. And so I was again presenting the Thomistic idea, which not just Thomas, but I mean really most of the great tradition, holds to God's simplicity, which is simply a way of saying that in God, essence and existence coincide. To be God is not to be any particular thing. To be God is to be to be. That's the way a contemporary Catholic theologian puts it. To be God is to be the sheer act of existence. And that means He's simple metaphysically. Because in any creature, you have, even in an angel, you have at least the distinction between what the angel is and that the angel is. Those are distinct, and that's why we call an angel a creature. But in God, they're not distinct. To be God is to be to be. That's the ground of an analogical conception of being. Now, all creaturely forms of being, from angels to insects, would be participations in, they'd be reflections of the pure act of existence, which is God. And so they don't exist competitively. If we increase in being, it doesn't threaten the to be of God. How could it? Because our being in its entirety comes from God. And so if I find glory, even in my own moral works, that glorifies God. It doesn't take glory away from God. You know, and that's why I always balk at when I read Luther with all his tremendous rhetorical power and tremendous theological insight. But I always balk at that point. It's as though he's always caught in that dilemma of, I can't give anything to the creature because it'll take away from God. And I'm like, no, I don't think you got to play that game. Anyway, that's I would say distinctively Thomistic and certainly Catholic view. Now Craig balked at it. I mean, Craig denies the simplicity of God and does see God as a being and sees no problem with that. We had actually a group of people that day, and the Catholics were all lining up, with Aquinas and saying, no, we don't want to call God a being because it leads to all these dilemmas and problems.
Now you understand why our Protestant friends often end up trapped in what you call a zero-sum game. If God is conceived as just one being among others, then any action we take, any virtue we display, or any cooperation we offer will automatically seem to take away from that glory. That is why you constantly hear the emphasis on faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone. Because within their framework, any form of participation in the divine life must be rejected as if it were a rival claim against God's sovereignty. As Martin Luther himself put it, man is nothing but a dung heap covered with snow. So for him, even when grace touched the sinner, it did not truly transform the person, but merely covered them. This way of thinking flows directly from the fear that if humanity were actually changed and elevated by grace, God's glory would somehow be diminished. But as Catholics, we do not have to play this zero-sum game. In our vision, God is not one competitor among others. He is not sitting on the same plane as creation, fighting for space and honor. He is instead the very ground of all being, the source of all life, the one in whom we live and move and have our being. This means our cooperation does not threaten Him, nor does it diminish Him. It becomes the very sign that His own grace is alive and active within us. Which is why St. Thomas Aquinas said, God is not only His own essence, but also His own existence, and therefore He is the very act of being itself. I hope this video is helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. God bless you.